Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating document submitted to the DOJ Anti-Weaponization Fund. And let me tell you, it reads a lot like a high-stakes legal thriller, just unfolding right there on the public record. We're going to examine a formal application for compensation that systematically lays out a massive claim against the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, specifically regarding how they enforce the COVID-19 vaccine mandate. Now, just to be super clear right out of the gate, we're strictly looking at what the source document itself claims. We're going to analyze how the author constructs his argument through evidence, legal theory, and a deeply personal narrative.
So let's dive right in. The entire application really hinges on one core, incredibly ironic question about the claimant, Stephen Bennett. How exactly does a senior analyst get fired for analyzing? You see, according to the document, Bennett wasn't just your run-of-the-mill employee. He was a senior management workforce planning analyst, recruited by the Federal Reserve right after the 2008 financial crisis to build out their internal analytics. His literal job description was to identify the risks that institutions miss. But then, in 2022, Bennett was terminated after his medical exemption for the vaccine mandate was denied. And this document? This is his meticulously built case for why that termination wasn't just a simple policy disagreement, but a documented institutional failure.
All right, moving right into Section 1, the architecture of coercion and foreknowledge. Bennett starts his narrative at the macro level. He's not arguing that this mandate was born out of sudden panic. Actually, scratch that. He's arguing the exact opposite, that it was a deliberately constructed permission structure. He lays out a very specific timeline to show the government had contemporaneous knowledge of the legal and medical risks. For example, back in October 2020, an FDA advisory committee drafted a list of possible adverse events. Fast forward to July 2021, and the Office of Legal Counsel issues a memo saying federal law didn't prohibit mandating an emergency use authorization, or EUA product. According to the application, this timeline proves the administration knowingly authorized overriding a statutory right of refusal way before the mandates actually dropped. Then the application zooms in on the fine print. Literally, Bennett points to an August 2021 FDA approval letter footnote to allege deliberate misrepresentation. The claim asserts that while the public was being told full FDA approval had finally arrived for the Comirnaty vaccine, the government was, in reality, administering a legally distinct EUA product. He argues that's a huge deal because individuals who are holding out, conditioning their compliance on full FDA approval, were being coerced with a product that simply didn't meet that specific legal condition.
The document also builds its case by pointing to a systemic suppression of information, specifically calling out the Virality Project. And get this number, 85%. When Congress subpoenaed records about the suppression of vaccine-related content on major platforms, 85% of the 1,019 internal tracking tickets, those are known as JIRA work orders, were withheld. Bennett argues that the tickets we could actually see confirm the removal of entirely truthful content. He frames this not as some big accident, but as a highly organized, tracked effort to conceal the truth from the public and from congressional oversight.
To really drive home the gravity of these systemic actions, the application brings in Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch. Writing in May 2023, Gorsuch described these pandemic policies, including the threat of losing your job for non-compliance and the pressure on social media to suppress information, as potentially the greatest intrusion on civil liberties in the peacetime history of the United States. This is a crucial pivot in Bennett's narrative. It takes the case from one guy's employment dispute and blows it up into a massive precedent affecting the civil liberties of every American. Which naturally brings us to Section 2, the target and the oath. Here, the story shifts from macro policy down to the specific people who had to live through it. So who exactly bore the brunt of this? Bennett cites attitudinal research to argue that this whole coercion architecture specifically targeted a socio-culturally distinct group of people. We're talking about people of faith, rural residents, and folks with a deep, institutionally grounded skepticism. The application claims this specific demographic was the absolute least equipped to navigate a confusing, labyrinth-like federal exemption process. The argument here is that making compliance incredibly difficult was actually a deliberate feature, designed specifically to overcome ideological resistance. And that leads to a really fascinating concept the application calls the oath inversion. Remember, Bennett was a federal civilian employee, which means he took a sworn oath to support and defend the Constitution. Bennett explains that, based on his own rigorous, real-time analysis of the emergency use authorization framework and his statutory rights, accepting the mandate would have actually forced him to break that oath. The document masterfully frames this not as a case of workplace insubordination, but as an impossible trap where a sworn officer was coerced to choose between feeding his family and keeping his constitutional commitments. Now let's look at Section 3, the human cost. We're zooming in from those broad legal arguments to the intensely personal impact outlined in the claim.
This is where the narrative gets stark and, honestly, pretty devastating. At the exact moment he was terminated by the Federal Reserve for non-compliance, Stephen Bennett was an active cancer patient. The document lays out how this separation cost him literally everything: his income, his home, and crucially, his health insurance, right at a time when his medical history made it absolutely irreplaceable.
And the human cost went way beyond just financial ruin. Because of this mandate, Bennett suffered the permanent loss of access to the specific physician who had intimately managed his care for 30 years. The application argues that Bennett's unique individual risk profile, which his doctor knew inside and out, was completely overridden by generic, population-level reasoning from a board physician who had never even met him.
To anchor this tragic personal outcome, the application cites a very real, documented EEOC ruling, Andy B. versus Jerome H. Powell. That ruling found on the record that the Federal Reserve Board of Governors had predetermined exemption denials before individual requests were ever actually reviewed. Bennett uses this external finding to claim that his own treating physician's expert judgment was never truly weighed or considered. He calls the entire accommodation process a procedural fiction.
Let's zoom back out for Section 4, civilian versus military precedent, where the document compares how different branches handled all this fallout. Bennett draws a really sharp, striking contrast here. Think about it. The military mandate, which kind of normalized this whole policy in the first place, was eventually rescinded. The Department of Defense acknowledged the wrong, they restored service records, and they offered compensation to service members. But on the flip side, the federal civilian workforce, who the document argues were subjected to the exact same coercion architecture, got absolutely nothing. No rescission, no restitution, no apology. Bennett powerfully refers to the civilian workers as the unacknowledged remainder. And that brings us to the final part, Section 5, the relief requested. To correct this documented institutional failure, Bennett has a very specific set of demands for the DOJ Anti-Weaponization Fund. First up is the financial claim. Bennett is asking for a staggering $1.83 million in monetary compensation. According to the text, this isn't just a random number. It reflects his lost wages plus the severe, catastrophic, consequential damages regarding his active cancer care, the loss of his housing, and the total disruption of his medical treatment. He's explicitly demanding parity with the military restitution we just talked about.
But you know, his demands go way beyond just a check. He is also demanding full funding for law school tuition, arguing that having to navigate this legal labyrinth unrepresented proved he needed the legal competency. He wants a rock-solid institutional policy at the Fed ensuring genuine medical review going forward, and perhaps most boldly, he requires a formal written apology from the Federal Reserve Chair. He wants explicit acknowledgement that his initial real-time analysis of the mandate was legally correct all along, and that they fired him for exercising the exact independent judgment they hired him for. The application concludes by directly challenging the historical record. Bennett insists that choices made with this level of foreknowledge simply do not belong in the category of a simple policy error. Through this explainer, we've traced his narrative arc, from the systemic timelines of the FDA and LSC down to the devastating personal toll on a cancer patient, all the way to his demands for ultimate accountability. Based on the claims in this source material, we have to ask ourselves, will the federal civilian workforce remain the unaddressed casualties of this era? And more importantly, if this architecture of coercion was successfully deployed once, what kind of precedent does that set for the future of our civil liberties? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. See you next time.